Belief in God. God as Father, the principle of creative genius, or God as Mother, the womb of creation. It's the understanding of Judaeo-Christian monotheism that God is one, neither male nor female in himself, but absolute and beyond both. Nevertheless, our tradition relates to God as Father rather than as Mother. Why? Why do we not think of ourselves as having been conceived in God's being as if he were a motherly womb, our own being essentially continuous with God's, before we enter the concrete creation in which we grow and acquire physical mass and extension? Why do we not think of ourselves as being essentially coexistent with God in the beginning? And what would that mean if it were true? When God spontaneously creates the heaven and earth polarity at the beginning of creation, the very first sexual act, and then hovers over the waters before similarly creating light or energy, he equally spontaneously conceives these entire interdependent enduring elements, natures, held together and limited by their intrinsic potentialities. In fact, God's creation of heaven and earth can be nothing other than his creation of the heavens and the earth's potentials to independently endure in sexual union as heaven and earth, their duration here being the consequence of their elementary actions, which are simply incarnations of God's eternally existent creative activity, realizing its own creative potentials. Insofar as when God creates, he's merely realizing in time and space potentialities eternally and fully implicated in his own eternal capacity for creation. He's entirely spontaneously merely bringing these forth from his creative being, already perfect and complete, without any need of gestation or preconception through deliberation. Their existence as creative potentialities doesn't depend on their being preconceived. It depends only on absolute being's capacity to conceive them, which is to say, to create them. Catholic doctrine speaks of God creating according to a plan, and this does communicate the vitally important truth that the nature of created nature is intended by God to be as it is. However, even though his creation is purposeful, it is still entirely spontaneous and unplanned, guided only by God's creativity's inherent nature, which is so perfect that it requires no preliminary deliberation. The entire universe is implicate, to borrow a term used by the physicist David Bohm in his 1980 book Wholeness and the Implicate Order, in the spontaneous creativity of God's absolute oneness. And that's the only plan that he needs to create it. In fact, an infinite number of instantiations of the universe must be implicate in God's creativity. Because for creatures to be creatures at all, and distinct from God, every one of them must be invested with the autonomous power to, together in relationship with every other creature, determine its own future. This is an ongoing process, and until each determination is made, not even the creatures who make them know what those determinations are going to be. It's this relative autonomy of creatures in their determinations of their futures that implies an infinite number of potential instantiations of our universe. This means that no one, not even God, can know the future with certainty. The present is the battleground of competing wills that determines the future. If the future could be known with certainty, this would mean that all acts of free will and present struggles between different wills are mere illusions, since the future has already been determined by chains of causes and conditions that have already been established. No matter what anyone may say in support of such a view, no one actually lives like this. We all make decisions constantly which we understand to be real decisions. It's foolish to believe the contrary to what we assume to be true in our daily behavior. Either God's creation is genuinely independent of him through his creatures' sovereign wills, or he can actually know the future as if it were present and real. He can't have both. Neither the universe nor God are machines whose movements can be predicted like those of a clock. They don't have parts that move purely as a result of causes and conditions, but rather possess some capacity to spontaneously act, whether that capacity be absolute, as with God, or relative and infinitesimal in scale and importance, as with subatomic particles. Creatures behave like musicians in a great symphony, as Tolkien described the developing universe in his Silmarillion. This is true of the very simplest of them and the most complex, and in this key way all are made in the image of God, not just mankind. The Bible attaches this principle especially to man, since the human being is the fullest and most developed realization of it. But it's necessarily a universal principle that's key to understanding how natural evolution proceeds harmoniously. Even if an individual creature's behavior becomes disordered, it is still actively contained by the whole, so that the harmony of the whole reacts against that individual's disharmony, limiting the extent of its disruption and placing pressure on it to restore its own inner harmony and its proper relationship with the whole. This is the framework in which the accidental evolution of species by natural selection proceeds, its ultimate environment being God, so that, with the proviso that the natural and the supernatural do not here exclude each other, it would better be called evolution by supernatural rather than natural selection. The key to the interdependent wholeness of creation is the oneness of its creator and his omnipresence throughout what he's created. And since God as universal creator necessarily must be creation's ultimate environment, it is surely legitimate to think of him as mother, the womb of all creation. The reason our tradition has actively resisted thinking of God in this way, I think, has been to do with its rejection of idolatry. There is a particular danger in thinking of God as feminine, as mother, and it is that in stressing the continuity of being between creator and creature, the actual distinction between creator and creature can be lost. Then, creatures come to identify themselves essentially as divine, and accordingly forget the true status of God as universal creator. In this manner, the human being enters into great danger, imperiled by losing the sense of his or her true place in creation, which, as the Catholic publisher Frank Sheed put it in his book Theology and Sanity, is key to our very soundness of mind. When we lose the sense of God's reality and absolute grandeur, we find ourselves caught between the Scylla of absolute egoism and the Charybdis of absolute worthless oblivion. The distinction between creation and creator in their relationship with each other, in the male symbolism of the Judaeo-Christian tradition, safeguards the human being from this spiritual peril. Behind the male symbolism of the Judeo-Christian tradition, God creates the heaven and the earth from nothing but himself. Here, the implied continuity of being between creator and creature is undeniable. God then commands the earth and the waters to fulfill their given interdependent natures by bringing forth living things. We are the last of those living things to be formed from the created elements by the power God is continuing to invest in them to do this. No earthly act of bringing forth living things brings them forth from nothing. They are all merely earthly realizations of creative potentialities implicate in the Creator's being. It's in this way that creatures freely and without necessarily knowing it always carry out the ultimate will of God and obey His creative word. We creatures with our varying degrees of free will are, through our free actions, co-creators with God of His created universe. Both He and we are purposive in our actions, and it's through these mundane and divine actions together that we cause this earthly home of ours to endure. When God creates, He doesn't just begin the existence of His creation, but invests it with the power to endure for as long as it does, and gives Himself over to it to provide it with its fundamental enduring substance for this duration. In other words, divine creation necessarily involves the Creator in what He creates from beginning to end. He doesn't just give it its power to endure at its beginning, but continues to give it throughout its existence. All of this at the same time, proceeding from the heaven and the earth, which themselves are continually being brought into existence from nothing but God's spontaneously creative word. God Himself, as the very archetype of existence, as part or as whole, in other words, as the wisdom needed to create our universe in all its complexity, or as the plan of creation itself. God as the image of Himself in the fullness of all His creative potentialities. Our most immediate place of gestation is our own mother's womb, itself formed by the earth at God's command in the context of His ordering of the elemental cosmos after having begun its existence on the first day. However, He was conceived. The earthly Jesus also gestated in His mother's womb, just as we did, and differed from us not in His fundamental unity with God, but in His conscious realization of this unity for our sake, as the Christ, by virtue of His choosing to be free from sin. He communicated the possibility of making this choice to all who accept Him, thereby inviting their repentance of sin.